going live to the UN headquarters. The second day of the debate continues at the United Nations General Assembly on the resolution on the necessity to eliminate the U.S. blockade imposed against Cuba for over 6 decades. Let's go to the headquarters of the National Assembly to listen to the statements of different international representatives.
Mr. President, Malaysia aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of ASEAN, NAM, Group of 77, and China and the OIC. Mr. President, Malaysia joins others in strongly opposing the imposition of unilateral coercive measures against any country, including Cuba. Such measures are inconsistent with the principles of sovereign equality and contravene international law, international humanitarian law, the Charter of the United Nations, and the norms and principles of peaceful resolutions among states. The long-standing unilateral coercive measures against Cuba have severely constrained the economy and restricted its ability to develop. Between March 2024 and February 2025, the blockade has resulted in losses exceeding $7 billion, which is about 49% more compared to the same period in the previous year. In addition, the blockade had adversely affected Cuba's commercial relations, creating serious obstacles in the banking and financial operations, international trade, access to credit and financing, fuel procurement, and engagement with suppliers critical to national development. It has also discouraged foreign investment. The country has lost vital income needed to purchase food, medicines, and medical supplies, including powdered milk for children and essential items for social development. These illegal measures have further undermined key sectors such as tourism, biotechnology, energy and mining, information and communications technology, construction, and transport. The cumulative impact has constrained Cuba's growth and negatively impacted the well-being of its people. The unilateral economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba must end immediately and unconditionally, including the removal of Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. Mr. President, there is an urgent need to eliminate the practice of imposing unilateral coercive measures as a means of pursuing political objectives. The real victims are the ordinary people who are deprived of social economic development and essential services, including education and healthcare for the children. Therefore, Malaysia continues to support the annual United Nations General Assembly resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. In this regard, Malaysia calls upon the parties concerned to resolve their differences through dialogue and to refrain from actions that are not consistent with international law and UN practices. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, Indonesia aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of ASEAN, the Non-Aligned Movement, the OIC, and the Group of 77 in China. Indonesia echoes the Secretary General's report, which highlights the severe and continuing impact of the embargo on the people of Cuba, from economic hardship and developmental stagnation to restriction on access to food, medicine, and other essential supplies. The economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed against Cuba contradicts to the fundamental principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Embargo has not only hindered Cuba's economic growth, but has also exacerbated its socio-economic challenges. Such conditions undermine the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and jeopardize our shared commitment to leaving no one behind. Mr. President, unilateral acts such as this embargo have consistently eroded trust in multilateralism and weakened collective efforts to achieve global prosperity. This embargo, which has endured longer than any other unilateral measure in modern history, represents a continuing obstacle to international cooperation. In this regard, Indonesia rejects all attempt to further strengthen the unilateral embargo against Cuba. We reaffirm our principled position in support of the resolution calling for its immediate termination. We also support the call to delist Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. Mr. President, ending the embargo would not only improve the welfare and uphold the legitimate rights of the Cuban people, including its right to development, but also restore the integrity of this assembly and reaffirm our commitment to multilateralism. Indonesia will continue to stand in solidarity with Cuba and with all nations that uphold the principles of international law, equality, and justice, as we strive together to realize our shared vision of peace, dignity, and prosperity for all. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. ويسرني الآن أن أعطي الكلمة.
And it's now my pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency, the Permanent Representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, Algeria aligns itself with the statements delivered on behalf of the African Group, the OIC, NAM, and the G77. We wish to add the following remarks on our national capacity. At the outset, Algeria is honored to welcome His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba. We commend his country's enduring commitment to the principles of solidarity, dignity, and independence. We also express our appreciation to the Secretary General for his comprehensive reports on this important matter, containing in document A/80/83. Mr. President, guided by the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, Algeria reiterates its unwavering support for the immediate and unconditional lifting of the unjust economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba for more than 6 decades. This policy runs contrary to the fundamental principles of international law and of the Charter of the United Nations, including the sovereign equality of states, non-interference in internal affairs, and freedom of international trade and navigation. It remains one of the most enduring examples of unilateral coercive measures that contravene the spirit of multilateralism and the collective objective of the United Nations. Algeria expresses its deep concern and disappointment at the persistence of this embargo, its humanitarian and socio-economic consequences have been extensively documented in the Secretary General's report. The blockade continues to impose enormous hardship on the Cuban people and severely undermines Cuba's efforts to achieve the SDGs by 2030. We strongly oppose, by principle, the imposition of unilateral laws and decisions that affect the sovereignty and development of other states. Algeria firmly rejects all unilateral coercive measures not authorized by the relevant organs of the United Nations, as they violate human rights, as they hinder international cooperation, as they obstruct the well-being of peoples. In this context, Algeria calls for the removal of Cuba from the unilateral list of alleged state sponsors of terrorism, a designation that is unjustified and detrimental to international trust and cooperation. Finally, President, we reaffirm our steadfast support and fraternity and solidarity with Cuba. Accordingly, my delegation will vote in favor of the draft resolution, as we have consistently done in previous years. I thank you.
أشكر سعادة المندوب الدائم.
I thank His Excellency, the Permanent Representative of Algeria.
To the distinguished representative of Laos People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, my delegation aligns itself with the statements delivered by Uganda, Iraq, and Singapore on behalf of NAM, the G77, and China and ASEAN, respectively, and echoes the principal call to end the embargo against Cuba. We would like to warmly welcome the presence of His Excellency Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Perilla of Cuba at this session, and also would like to thank the Secretary General for his report on this important agenda item. The LAPDR reiterates its unwavering solidarity with the people and government of Cuba. The embargo, which has remained in place for more than 6 decades, is in direct contradiction to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and well-established norms of international law. This prolonged and unilateral measure has not only inflicted severe socioeconomic consequences on the Cuban people, but also hindered their legitimate right to development, sovereignty, and national self-determination. At a time when the world is facing unprecedented challenges, from widening inequalities and intensified geopolitical tensions to global health crisis and climate-related disasters, it is morally indefensible and politically unjustifiable to maintain coercive measures that exacerbate human suffering and restrict inclusive development. The LAPDR strongly believes that no country should be denied the opportunity to chart its own development path free from external pressure and interference. In this regard, we support the adoption of the successor resolution under this agenda item, namely Resolution A/80/L.6, and recognize it as a resounding expression of the view of the international community, a consistent call for justice, fairness, and respect for international law. It is through such multilateral actions that we pave the way towards a more peaceful, equitable, and just world for all nations, large and small. Mr. President, The Lao PDR is of the view that unilateral coercive measures not only contradict the UN Charter and international law, but also hinder sustainable development and impose unjust suffering on innocent people. We must therefore redouble our efforts to foster an enabling environment for peace and development cooperation among all nations. In this regard, the Lao PDR once again joins the international community in calling for the ending of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against the Republic of Cuba, as well as for the removal of Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and the elimination of all unilateral coercive measures imposed on sovereign countries. In conclusion, the Lao PDR called on all member states to renew our collective resolve to uphold the Charter of the United Nations, safeguard the sovereign rights of nations, and foster inclusive and sustainable development, especially for countries unjustly affected by coercive measures, and to ensure that the people of Cuba, like all peoples around the world, are given the freedom to thrive and determine their own destiny. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Laos People's Democratic Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking you for convening this important meeting to consider once again the urgent necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba. This debate is central to our collective commitment to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and the sovereign equality of all states. My delegation aligns itself with the statements delivered on behalf of the African Group, NAM, and the G77 and China. We add the following remarks in a national capacity. We welcome the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla. We commend the government of Cuba for highlighting the devastating impact of the blockade on the daily lives and well-being of the Cuban people. Cuba's most recent report offers a sobering account of human suffering, an undeniable indictment of the far-reaching consequences of unilateral coercive measures. It makes clear that with each passing day, the blockade not only inflicts pain on ordinary people, but it also hinders Cuba's path towards sustainable development. Mr. President, that the General Assembly has been seized with this matter for the 33rd consecutive year is a stark reminder that the will of the international community continues to be disregarded. While resolutions have consistently expressed overwhelming rejection of the embargo, meaningful progress towards its removal have remained elusive. This persistent defiance of international law has subjected the Cuban people to prolonged hardships and constitutes a flagrant violation of their sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Equally concerning is the continued unjustified inclusion of Cuba on the so-called list of state sponsors of terrorism, an action that has further curtailed the country's access to international financial systems and development programs. The cumulative effect of these measures has been the deliberate obstruction of Cuba's socio-economic progress, in clear contradiction to the spirit of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Mr. President, no country should be denied access to life-saving medicines, technology, financial services, agricultural equipment, and fair trade. Yet this remains the daily reality for the people of Cuba under the weight of an embargo devoid of moral or legal legitimacy. The continuation of this policy is an affront to multilateralism, an impediment to development, and a violation of the fundamental rights and dignity of the entire nation. Zimbabwe is also a victim of unilateral coercive measures. We too have witnessed firsthand how these measures can asphyxiate economies and restrict social progress. We stand in solidarity with the people of Cuba, both as a matter of principle and as a testament to the bonds of friendship that exist between our two countries and peoples. We therefore reiterate our call for member states to refrain from enacting and enforcing unilateral measures contrary to international law and the purposes and principles of the Charter. Mr. President, Zimbabwe commends the government and people of Cuba for their resilience in the face of injustice. Despite these formidable challenges, Cuba continues to meaningfully contribute towards international cooperation through medical brigades. These medical brigades have saved millions of lives across the world. In conclusion, the impact of the blockade on the population of Cuba is well documented. The overwhelming support for the resolution calling for its end is enduring. What is required now is decisive action. Our unified call for the United States to review its policy of sanctions and to lift the embargo should persist until the people of Cuba are free to earnestly pursue sustainable development. We also call for the immediate removal of Cuba from the so-called list of state sponsors of terrorism, a designation that is both unjust and detrimental to international cooperation. Zimbabwe will continue to stand in solidarity with the people of Cuba and advocate for the respect of multilateralism, mutual respect, and adherence to the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Mexico.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I would begin by welcoming the presence of the Foreign Minister of Cuba, Don Bruno Rodriguez, at the General Assembly. Year after year, we meet in this forum with the unequivocal expectation that an end will be brought to the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed against Cuba for more than 6 decades. We see that the member states of the United Nations have each year and overwhelmingly voted in favor of lifting the blockade. However, there is continued disrespect for this majority will of the international community and of the resolutions of this General Assembly. It would seem that we still cannot escape from the prejudices and intolerances that characterized the policy of the politics of the Cold War, which in historical terms has proven without question to have failed. In the context of the recent high-level week, the Secretary of Foreign Relations of Mexico reiterated our historic stance against the embargo and the call for removing Cuba from the list of states that support terrorism. The minister also said that Mexico will always advocate for the peaceful settlement of disputes and therefore rejects sanctions and commercial blockades that only harm the well-being of peoples and do not build regions of peace or of prosperity. Mexico also categorically condemns the application of Title III of the law of the so-called Helms-Burton Act. This is a measure that affects not only the sovereignty of the Cuban people, but also the national interests of third countries. It must be said clearly that any unilateral measure conceived of as a form of political pressure to influence the internal decisions of another state is a contravention of the principles of the United Nations Charter, as well as the constitutional principles of Mexico's foreign policy, and it is an impingement upon peace and stability between peoples. And it is the UN Charter itself which in Chapter 7 exclusively reserves for the Security Council the capacity to impose sanctions or other coercive measures for the maintenance of international peace. Therefore, Mexico maintains that there should be no sanctions of any sort beyond those that are adopted by the Security Council. Mr. President, Cuba is facing an economic crisis even worse than the one in the 1990s that is aggravated by the embargo and the strengthening of sanctions by the United States government. The country is even continuing to suffer from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, while the rest of the international community has managed to turn the page on this page of our contemporary history. That is compounded by high international oil prices, which is the result of conflicts that Cuba has nothing to do with, and natural disasters that continue to lash the entire Caribbean, hindering growth and economic well-being through unilateral impositions is contrary to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and equality of opportunities, which is something that Mexico advocates for in all international fora. The Cuban people deserves a more encouraging future, and they deserve not to be subject to decisions that were taken in a historical, political, and economic context that is very far removed from the one we live in today. New generations of Cubans deserve to live outside of the context of confrontation that Cuba was put in by the circumstances of the Cold War. At the same time, relations between neighbors on the American continent, based on respect and mutual understanding, are essential for the growth and development of the countries of the hemisphere. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Mexico.
I have the pleasure now to give the floor to Her Excellency, Deputy Permanent Representative of Egypt.
Well, we continue to see the second day of debate on the necessity, on the resolution, on the necessity to eliminate the U.S. blockade against Cuba. We were listening to different permanent representatives to the UN from different regions, from different countries of the world, and they continue to join in the call to end the blockade, to end the policies of unilateral coercive sanctions, and to also delist Cuba from the list of states sponsoring terrorism that is made unanimously as well, unilaterally by the U.S. State Department. We continue to see the same trend that we saw yesterday on the first day, a very overwhelming majority of people supporting Cuba and to bring an end to this policy that has lasted for more than 6 decades and hinders directly the development and future of Cuban families. Stay tuned with teleSUR English. We're going to continue to stay in touch with what is happening in New York.